Reuter, who commented that early on, as people were arriving, oh no, this feels like it's a repeat of my oral exams with some of his former professors. But it's really wonderful to be able to welcome him back to campus. And just, I'll mention briefly a few things. So Bernard Reuter wrote a wonderful dissertation on the German Jewish linguist and historian Victor Klemperer and diarist. And following that was assistant professor at St. Cloud State University, where he also directed their Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And after that, he then has moved to Basel and Freiburg, and now he lives in Colmar, where he has been engaged in a number of very interesting pedagogical projects involving the resuscitation of German Jewish culture, in part in Basel and in Colmar, and also in working with the refugees and the unfolding situation there, and that will be the topic of today's presentation. So I also want to thank the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. That was not what we were when Bernard was here. We were simply the very humble German, Scandinavian, and Dutch for co-sponsoring today's talk. So welcome, Bernard.
Thanks a lot, Liz. So thank you very much for coming to this talk today, and thanks for the invitation. This is really exciting. And I would just like to share with you a few kind of vignettes, a few insights, really on the atmosphere of the identity mix of the different approaches in dealing with the refugees, dealing with anti-Semitism from Germans, from the refugees, from new Arab Muslims in Germany, about the discourse that's going on there. And some of these things are things that you cannot really, it's difficult to write these things in an academic article because they're painful and they provoke right away all kinds of discussions. So thanks for this opportunity to share some perspectives on the refugee crisis and on anti-Semitism in Germany. This is always the case when dealing with these issues. It is important not to generalize about any of the groups one talks about, for they are as diverse as can be. In Germany, people talk about the refugees all the time, but as you know, they come from so many different countries, from so many different backgrounds, and it's simply the difference between African immigrants and Syrian Arab immigrants is immense. But I think it's worthwhile to consider some of their voices in order to understand the discourse and the identities behind them. So the anti-Semitic voices from the past audible in Germany today. From Germans remain mostly that which they always were. Projections of fear of other and of fear of self, I would argue, based on stereotypes of Jews as rich, controlling, ugly, intellectual, dealing and wheeling manipulators, representing the ultimate other within society, and most of the times substituting the state of Israel for Jews. Now this alone would be hard to say in Germany at a conference, because would right away provoke, of course, sentiments. But I might add, I am teaching right now in Switzerland, and the Swiss have a very different approach, of course, to anti-Semitism, to the Holocaust. I don't mean this in a critical way, but I've never heard so many jokes about Jews as I did since working in Switzerland. Because they don't have this guilt attached to it, or this kind of approach that you cannot say things openly the way you want to say. In an article, actually 3 days ago, the chairman of the AfD, of the Alternative Party for Germany, the new right-wing party that is in the German parliament now, Alexander Gauland, used images of the controlling capitalist forces with a certain Jewish coloring, copying thereby and paraphrasing from a speech by Adolf Hitler. As Wolfson and Benz, the leading historians in Germany on the topic, realized immediately. So this was going on yesterday. But now there's another other, farther removed from the German self, while at the same time also somehow close to that other, the Jews, forcing and causing misunderstandings up to the level where an Israeli Arab in Germany, and you might have heard about this, where an Israeli Arab in Germany just tries out wearing a kippah on the streets in Berlin, only to get attacked by a young German with Palestinian roots, or a Jewish Israeli American professor, getting arrested by the police because they thought him to be the aggressor after he was attacked by a Muslim refugee on the streets as well. So this stuff is happening every day almost now in Germany. And it's very confusing to understand who is who, or who is acting on which behalf. Because we have to be difficult when we talk about Muslim attacker, Jewish professor. We have to watch the language when referring to the sides, but just how, that is the question. We have to keep in mind that these events were also relatively harmless, yet their significance lies within the changing and unstable pattern of identities behind them. Have you heard about these incidents? I'm just curious. In a state of war, and that is the state that the Syrians import, or rather evoke in Germany with their presence, and I'm talking mostly about Syrians today. In a relative state of war, identity borders shift constantly for a number of reasons. For example, when I ask the Syrian refugees I work and I teach what they think about Assad, they cannot give me a clear answer. A lot of them left Syria because they don't want to be drafted. That's their biggest fear. A lot of the young men leave for that reason. At the same time, they have a kind of, they like him as a strong man. And they like Erdogan very much from Turkey for that reason, because he's a strong leader taking care of his people. So it's very ambivalent. At the same time, interestingly, the Christian Judeo roots in German culture are more often quoted today in Germany than ever. But how conflicted then? The Muslims and the Jews, being close related as two Semitic cultures, closer than Germans and Muslims, for example, provoke racial hate, although they were welcomed at first. First, that is, as those to be rescued from war and misery caused by Jews in part as well. Because what's happening is that there's a kind of projection of the, whether it's justified or not, that's another question, of the critique of Israel in Germany. It's getting stronger and stronger. The extreme, they say Israel is fascist, aggressive against the Palestinians occupying. But that conflict gets kind of projected on the Muslim refugees, so that they appear as a victim of Israel many times. And that's kind of the underlying, or one underlying current. And you probably also, once I was talking about a class of refugees, about this incident that you might have heard about as well, that there's a Jewish, an Israeli military hospital close to the Golan, where they take care of Syrian wounded. They have to bring them there at night, and then the Syrians are worried that their friends might hear that they were helped by Israelis. And I was telling them that story, and that was a big problem for them. They couldn't believe it, they didn't want to believe it. At the same time, they knew it was true. So for the last 2 years, I was teaching at the DHBW, that's Duale Hochschule Baden-Württemberg. That is university, Hochschule within the dual system, schooling and training together with a variety of regional businesses and employees, young professionals for BA and MA degrees. Now they try to integrate Syrians at this school who had previous academic experiences. The economy leaders in Germany state clearly that they need the refugees as trained professionals, for Germany's population depends on migration. So this is you hear this all the time in the news in Germany, but in the discourse on the streets, you never talk about that actually these people are needed in Germany as workers. The funny thing is that the refugees, they heard this themselves by now, and it's one of their arguments. They say, well, you need us, because you don't have enough young people, which is kind of makes for an almost funny, absurd thing. At the same time, there is a certain parallel with young Turks who came in the 60s to Germany, who also came because they were needed by the economy. They were needed as workers. So there are some mechanisms here that get repeated. So the program I was hired into is a pilot program to integrate refugees with these previous academic experiences. So in this program I met Mustafa. Mustafa is an Arab, a Muslim, and a Syrian. He was one of my first students, very kind and very funny, interested by all things Jewish, eager to hear about Jews in Germany. He was then about 19 years old, now he's 21. And we had a lot of jokes, we had a lot of fun, but he also was like kind of jokes. Once I pointed out to them that shalom and salam are kind of similar words. They hated that. And he said, their response from the class was, now they, meaning the Jews, they even stole the language from us. So in the beginning I was asked to teach values at this dual Hochschule without any curriculum. And this is totally true. So I said, of course, yes, German values, no problem. Right now we're in the process of putting together a report about how this works, teaching them German values. Because this report is for the government, the parliament of Baden-Württemberg, which is very, it's led by a green government. And they're very aware of the problem that's difficult to put into words. That there's more and more critique of Israel that comes from the presence, or that's connected with the presence of these young Syrians in Israel. And they try to get a grip on it. At the same time, it's very problematic, of course, and there's a document online from the Baden-Württemberg government saying we have to do something about critique against Israel. But that is very problematic, right? Can you put out a document as a government, as a local government, saying it's bad to critique Israel? That only provokes, of course, more critique. So it's very tricky. But they see the connection there. At the same time, there's a certain dynamic. Again, this is something, the best way to talk about it is in an anecdotal way. The secretary of the program were at this Duale Hochschule Baden-Württemberg, she went with her church choir to perform in Bethlehem, Christian choir. And they went explicitly not to Israel, which of course is totally fine. She just want to sing there. But she argued that they did not want to go there because they wanted to make a point, and they involved some of the refugees too in the project. They wanted to make a point that they, meaning the Jews, meaning Israel, would for once not win. So they wanted to make a point not to go to Israel. This is just a German secretary, right? She's not Jewish or anything, and she's not in other ways connected to the program. But so I'm just talking about my experience here, of course, but this very much reflects this sentiment that the Jews took over the suffering, the pain, the victim role, and there's more and more literature in Germany on the problem that working through the trauma as Germans of a lost war, of being defeated, that's only surfacing now. And there's a kind of very complex and difficult mix. So the question is, this anecdote of the secretary, the question is, what should the Jews or Israel for once not win? I would suggest it's the moral superiority over defeated Germany or the refugee crisis. I have a colleague there. Her name is Erika, just to call it that for now. She's a retired university professor, very serious Germanistic. She calls the refugees the Syrians who are all between 18, 19, and 30. Meine Kinder, my children. And she constantly talks about how they're misbehaving, thus she wants to educate them. So at the same time, I'm trying to teach German values. So after a while, we visited a former Nazi concentration camp in Alsace and a Jewish cemetery. That was our second field trip with this group. The first one was to a museum which was accompanied by bystanders on the street. We visited this museum, people on the street, seeing me with this group of refugees going to this exhibition. There were some who applauded, saying it was great that these refugees were being taught culture. So there's constantly this well-intended focus on things, but problematic, of course. And there were others complaining in a less nice way that they, the refugees, would not need that. And that criticism comes very often from people with a migration background themselves. But back to the visit to the camp, to the concentration camp with the Syrians. So after the excursion, after they checked out devices of torture, and to my surprise talked about such things as experts, as they knew them being used in Syria, I was asked, are you Jewish? And they said, it would be okay if you are a Jew. And I said, no, I'm not. I then was asked immediately, but why do you work for the Jews? So for them, doing these things, teaching about the Holocaust, dealing with the guilt, means you're working for that group, the Jews. And it took me a while to understand that they don't mix these things. They don't think it's necessary also to, for example, present their suffering as Muslims or as refugees from Syria. Whether they're Wirtschaftsflüchtlinge, whether they're refugees for economical reasons, or whether they fled war. I mean, I've seen everything, but I've heard stories that are horrible, what people experience, and I heard stories that people left because they looked for, a better life, which is legitimate too, of course. But they don't like to be represented as Muslims. They want to be left alone, actually. They don't, and the whole idea of an interreligious dialogue is very far from them. At least that's my experience. And this is a group, that's important to know too, this is a group, they have some academic experience in Syria already, they started to study there. So they're privileged in some ways. But there's a big difference, of course, to young Syrians, Arabs, who had no such previous experience, who maybe came from different families. So it's really a level of, it's a question of education, how open you are to understand the new environment. So besides teaching values and culture, Beethoven and Goethe, recycling methods, Mülltrennung, which is really funny. You know what it is, Mülltrennung? To live in Germany, you have to, in a very crazy way, divide plastic and glass and aluminium and everything. And that is, they get a kick out of that. So they think that's totally crazy. And they're always asking me, well, don't Germans have other problems? And I tell them, no, they don't. So, German dating. Sorry?
It's done here as well.
No, and it's a great thing, but it's it's absurd when you tell somebody who comes from a war zone. Well, you cannot put that into that box. You have to use the yellow box. So it's a situational thing. Teaching about East and West Germany, the war, and the downfall of the war. All of these things are mentioned in the A2 language acquisition book that the government issued. I was also teaching about the Holocaust, which is also mentioned in this book, and related issues to it. At one such occasion, my colleague, Erika, was peeking in, and after a while, getting really emotional and explaining she has a background, she comes from East Prussia. So she listened to this, and then she listened to these young Arabs learning about the Jews and the Holocaust in Germany, and she exclaimed, "Nobody ever helped us when we were refugees." So she was a refugee in Germany, and that's a statement that you hear often in Germany. Also, she is conflicted in that she, I changed her name, by the way, so you cannot find her. She is conflicted, I think, Because she points out that she's a social democrat, she's feminist, but these Arabs just drive her crazy. She doesn't, it's too much for her. So, besides, by the way, it's only 30% of these Syrians after 3 years are on the B1 level right now. So the language problem remains a big problem. So after units of recycling methods, the German divide and the war, the group came to the conclusion that the Syrian Arabs, and they said that very seriously, are now Germany's new Jews. So they just looked at me after studying all of this and they said, so we are your new Jews. You wanna teach us who to be. You want to assimilate. You want us to assimilate completely. Which was very interesting, and I did not know what to say about that. But there is something to it. It's like everybody in Germany is trying to educate these young people into one direction or the other. So I think to some extent they are. Because they are other, and yet if they want to stay in Germany, they have to be educated to become sane in order to become post-enlightenment citizens with semi-religious values taken from a religion other than their own, only to renounce and avert religiousness altogether. It is not difficult to see the potential for social conflict right there. So Erika was maybe jealous when she saw the group receiving so much more help than she ever got as a young refugee herself. And of course, she herself being part of the help that they get. How much time do I have left?
10 to 15 minutes.
That's good. Okay. And that's the spectrum of how people perceive the situation in Germany. Is like, it's a disaster, it's way too much for society to deal with. There's 1 million of refugees right now. In 1915 they came about close to 800,000, around 800,000. 16, by 2016, 17, it was around 120,000. Up to 2018 it's about 80,000. So it's about 1 million now. And the biggest crisis, refugee crisis in Europe after the war, was 12 million people. This was Erika, right? This is Erika's story. There were 12 million people lost in Europe. So some people say, kein Problem, wir schaffen das, this is America. A lot of other people think that too. The economy thinks it in Germany. They say, where's the problem? We just need to integrate them. We just need to give them jobs. But then there's and that's the important thing, how people perceive the situation is like a disaster. It's like too much for us. And we don't want this anymore. And there's a kind of certain anti-American resentment coming along with it. Anti-Israel, anti-American. And as you know, of course, there are all kinds of degrees, right? There's the ugly right-wing voice on the street saying that. And it sounds unfair to say it, but it is mostly in East Germany for several reasons. But there's also the more moderate voices who say, like, no, it's enough now, shouldn't do this. So it's 1 million refugees in Germany right now. By now, about 30% of them are in work, have a job. And these are very often low-paid jobs without benefits. And the prognosis is that within about 10 years, 60% of them will be in work, integrated in the work space. Most of these refugees are young men for several reasons. They take care of the family, and these very young men very often are put into the role of taking care of their parents, of the family. The parents are very often, they're our age, they don't learn German anymore. They think it's not worth it. So it's the young ones who learn German. So on the young ones, everything depends on them, you know, that they assimilate, they learn the language, that they get a job. They have low stress. 8% of them can't write or read. But those 8% are probably mostly from African refugees. I'm not saying this as a stereotype, but Syrians are usually educated to that degree that they had a basic schooling. I would like to give you a few topics. There was a conference last week in Ingolstadt at the Catholic University there on the refugee crisis. And a lot of people who seriously work on these topics were there. I want to just give you a few titles of the panels there to see what problems are dealt with right now. Refugee and gender, the European Union who's open within, but spends 3 times the amount of money to close the outside borders as they spent on helping refugees. So there's a certain movement there. The conflicts between human rights and the asylum law and ethical issues. Migration and refugee studies in change. Perspectives after being a refugee in Germany. And there's a parallel here with, again, the situation of the Turks, who were in the beginning regarded as being Gastarbeiter, right? They were supposed to leave. Probably nobody thought about that really seriously, but they did not leave and they stayed. And very often you have a sense of people from the center also say, well, we're going to help them now. And the educated ones, which is kind of a similar politics that the US is following right now, those we need can stay, the others will have to go back. The problem is very few refugees receive a permanent permit to stay. Most of them are just geduldet. I wasn't sure how to translate that word. Geduldet. Tolerated, yeah. Which is a legal term. And that can last for 3 years. So for 3 years you live in limbo. You don't know what's going to happen. And that's a big problem. The German bureaucracy is a big problem. Also, that die deutsche Amtssprache in Germany, every document that the Syrians bring with them has to be translated into German. It doesn't help them if they have an English translation, which most of them have. So, and that's only in Germany the case. The margins of the welfare state, medical issues, psychological issues, nutrition, housing of the refugees, that's a big problem. The communication in public, culture, gender, and space of refugees in Turkey. A lot of refugees went through Turkey, spent some time there, and then come to Germany. When you look at these lists, just on the side note, it's pretty obvious that it's all about Söhne und Männer, Rollenverhalten, the roles of men, sons, husbands. There's almost nothing being presented here about the role of women, the specific issues that young women might have to deal with. I'm just cutting that here, and I want to tell you a little bit about the different voices of anti-Semitism coming from the refugees. Mustafa and his friends, I think, the friends I met, are not anti-Semitic per se, but they have a sometimes very dangerous because confused fascination of things Jewish. They know that Jews and Christians and Muslims narratives share profits and more, but they believe, and that's how they express this, but they believe that Jews messed up things religiously in a theological way. Thus, I think there is a very basic and raw anti-Semitic ground that is actually dangerous. The Syrians think less evil of their former colonial masters, for example, as they talk about Jews. They know that Jewish culture in Arab countries once belonged there, but also that the post-colonial war with Israel ended the possibility for that shared cultural space. So they would very often say, yes, of course, the Jews, they lived in Damascus, we have a Jewish quarter, it's wonderful. But of course, there are no more Jews there. Now, of course, they're gone. So it's kind of a given for them that that's ended. And they're convinced that the Jews rule Germany. Since, since they're taught by people who work for the Jews. Jewish voices are very interesting right now. The chairman of the Zentralrat der Juden in Germany is a very balanced, Josef Gaffner is a very balanced voice. He says we Jews, we know exactly what it means to pursue, so we should help them. But he also has to deal with the problem that there are anti-Semitic attacks. A few days ago, there was Henrik Reuter in Germany, who is always good for a surprising or funny voice in Germany. He said this is all crazy and there should be no more Muslims in Germany. Since a few days also, this all just happened in the last few days. There is a new group established, also in Baden-Württemberg, of Jews in the AfD. And this is kind of, I wanted to say twisted, but it's difficult to understand. A lot of these Jews have Russian backgrounds, Russian immigration backgrounds. There were a few interviews the last few days, and they said, look, there's anti-Semitism everywhere. And at least if we work in this party, who is openly anti-Semitic, you could say that. The chairman, Gauland, he wrote a letter 2 days ago. I talked about the letter already. So, but they said, at least when we involve ourselves in that party, we can protect German values. So it's again. And there are many more of these, report many more of these incidences. I think a few are enough to understand. They say the discourse, or they often say that the discourse is enthemmed, liberated, but in the worst case. So what is lacking right now is the culture of discourse. Concretely, it is the biggest task, I think, to educate, but this sounds horrible already, to educate these young Syrians. Because their problem with the Jews, or their problem with Israel, actually they differentiate much more between Jews and Israel than Germans do. They very often say like, well, we have no problems with the Jews, but Israel is our enemy, which is kind of true, right? But to teach them these values, these post-Enlightenment need for a religious discourse, for tolerance, that is new for them, and that I think is the biggest task right now. I have a few other things, but maybe I can mention them if you have questions or if you want to talk about other things. So I think I'll stop here.
Well, wonderful. It's wonderful to hear what so many of us are reading about in the paper. You know, the New York Times just last week broke that story about the German Jews in large numbers joining the AfD, which was quite a shock to many. But, well, I certainly have much to say, but I'd like to open it up. I'm sure there are many questions and comments. You've really given us a wonderful overview of the situation. And the one thing also I neglected to say in my introduction, which filtered in a little bit, is the work you've been doing with some interfaith dialogue groups of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So maybe also some questions about that, but why don't we open?
Well, I think I learned the meaning of that word from Stephen Feinstein, who is not here, of course. You know, I'm thinking a lot about Stephen Feinstein and Nira Weinberg today, my two teachers here at this place. So, and actually, Stephen really lived the word interfaith dialogue. He was really open to everything.
What is the attitude of the old the Turks who are now assimilated well assimilated in Germany, the old guest worker faction, which is a number of millions, and especially in the Ruhr.
Towards the Syrians?
Pardon?
Towards the Arabs?
Well, yeah, versus their own affinity to where they came from. Because you have the integral Turkish population, and how do they react to this whole situation that you described? Is there any unity among them?
Between the Turks and the Syrians?
Yeah, in the Turkish element that came here in the 60s, 50s to the 80s.
Well, I think they have their own way of how they assimilated, how they, you know, Erdogan just opened the biggest mosque in Cologne last week. So they have Turks have their own way of assimilation on the weekend. The young Syrians, they buy their food in Turkish stores in Germany because that's the one place where they, get food that feels good to them and tastes good to them. They don't like German food. That's obvious. But they're also skeptical. And the Turks as well, you very often hear voices there saying, well, nobody helped us. We had to work hard here, to make it. So there's competition. There's a sense of competition.
Do they voice, they're a sizable minority, do they voice their feelings in Parliament or in the national dialogue, or are they sort of just in the background?
There's some, for example, there's one very prominent Green Party political leader in the parliament with Turkish background. He's very popular. But most of the focus right now in regard to the Turks in Germany is about Erdogan, right, how that plays out. And Erdogan, of course, is holding the European community hostage because when he opens the border, then there may be a few more millions coming towards Europe. And people don't understand why Germany and other European countries still talk to Erdogan. And the Turks in Germany are aware of that. And then you have the Turkish president visiting Germany and telling the Turks living in Germany, how many are there? 3 million. Telling them, don't forget that you are Turks. You might have a German passport, but you remain Turkish. So there's another conflict there.
So early on, you said you were teaching values without a syllabus, and near the end, you were talking about, I believe one of those values must have been tolerance. What other values did you wind up teaching, and how did they react to them?
I'm not sure if I succeeded in teaching values. And how do we teach that? Well, you have to be a role model, being open, talk about everything. The recycling thing was difficult for them. The big issue is, so there are several books, German acquisition books in Germany, done for refugees. So people, pictures in the books, they can see they're Muslims, they're people from different Arab countries. And one very difficult topic is dating. That's mentioned in the book too. And that is very difficult. Because and again, I never want to generalize, that's difficult. But what you see over and over again is, these are young men, they have stress, and they think it's exciting that German young women are much more open in many ways, and the women in their own culture. And it's not that they all, treat their own women bad. It's not that. I had Syrian women, very few, but Syrian young women in the class too, and some of them had a headscarf, others not. But that they say, oh, but for marrying, I would only marry another Arab Muslim. So I think it's a generational thing. It'll take 1 or 2 generations until it's open. So it's ambivalent. Everything is ambivalent. I'm sorry, but I feel like that's what I only kind of present, right? That everything is in flow, everything is questioned right now. And I think the biggest, to me, one of the most important things is that German identity gets questioned. If you think about it, Germans wanted to do the right thing. I'm convinced that Merkel, the chancellor, she's a humanist, she wants to open the country. She comes from East Germany, she had a sense of responsibility. But there's a circle here, right? That because of the war, responsibility after the war, also the Holocaust, because after the war, Jews were the victims, not the Germans, right? It was the victim role was the Jews. Germans could not work through their trauma, maybe, as having lost the war, being defeated. And so, in an indirect way, because of that situation with the Jews, was this effort to do something good. And now we are in a mess. And whose fault is it? The Jews. I'm simplifying, of course, but this circle you see more and more, I think.
Is that a German perception?
Yeah.
When you were talking about seeing Syrian refugees as victims of Israel, now this isn't the Syrian perception, is it? That's
No.
a German perception.
Yeah.
Which is
Totally, yeah.
nuts.
I mean, the Syrians know that they're at war with Israel, you know, that Israel is part of the imperialist Western world attacking their identity. So there is a connection there.
Yeah, but who's fleeing Syria because of Israel? They're fleeing
Nobody in
Syria
a
because of
concrete way.
Assad or ISIS, or because the cities are bombed, because the cities are unlivable, you know.
No,
that's
of
what
course.
they're fleeing.
But they would say, you know, I mean, once in a while there is an Israeli jet flying over Syria, you know. So that's enough. And they say, look, Israel is our war enemy. So, you know, and what they say very often is, actually the whole world is playing war over Syria. The Russians, the Americans, the Israelis, NATO, Germans, and someone too. Right, so.
I just want to come back, since you mentioned the hospital in Golan Heights. You know, we had some of the doctors from the Columbia
Wow.
Hospital were part of a delegation here to the Twin Cities about 6 months ago or something like that. So had they, was this the first that they had learned of the hospital project and bringing the Syrian refugees over the border at the Golan Heights? Or
I had a few older students,
Mhm.
in their 30s, they knew about it. It was not new to them. For the young ones, they were kind of horrified.
Because it complicated their perception.
Yeah, I
of
mean,
what was happening at the
if
border.
that's the enemy, and then you hear that the arch enemy is helping you somehow, that's problematic, of course. I think you had a question?
About Jews during the war, it's not very surprising for me because the Russian Jews who arrived in Israel in the beginning of the 90s, absolute majority of them voted right. Well, maybe not to such extreme extent, but certainly the right-wing government, which currently is in Israel in many respects owes his power to the post-Soviet immigration, who generally just was really allergic to the left out of obvious reasons of being in the Soviet Union. So it's not very surprising that, in light of that, such things happen in Germany, especially that those people, the Jews who come from ex-Soviet Union, particularly Russia, which is a whole other mess. But they probably sense here in the voice of this party things which sort of maybe other less extreme right-wing parties just wouldn't dare to say. But it's a kind of post-Soviet spirit, post-Soviet pro-capitalist, and in a sense, yes, imperialist spirit, which is very evident in Israel and in a great deal of Russian Jewish population, and it probably has similar reverberations because then it's about, again, it's about our values, which are the capitalist values, which are values of liberal freedom, and so it's not surprising to say.
And in terms of, you know, broken up identities or identities question, as you know, the Russian Jewish immigrants to Germany forced the Jewish communities in Germany to kind of redefine themselves. The Russians they didn't have a Jewish tradition that they lived and had to relearn. So these Russian Jews who maybe now the AfD, you know, they try to situate themselves to find a place within a Jewish identity. So.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to give one comment and I have one question. First, the comment that concerns the first question about the Turkish community in Berlin and their reaction in Germany. I think it's really complicated. For the example of Berlin, for example, we cannot speak of the Turkish community.
Yeah.
It's really impossible. It's split 40-60. You know, we have 60% conservatives, right-wing voters. They would vote rather right-wing in Germany. Erdogan supporters, and the other 40, about 40%, either Kurdish or Alawi, so targeted minorities within the Turkish conflict itself. So we have right now, since the coup 2 years ago in Turkey, a situation where Turks are spying on Turks in Germany. And of course, it's not only a split between left and right, it's more complex, but these two groups, or more of these groups, they react very differently, I think, to the situations with refugees. So there was a famous incident now 3-4 years ago where Turkish right-wingers, conservatives, went with kind of hand weapons or more like sticks against the refugee camp on the Oranienplatz in Berlin. Yeah. So there were Turks, the former immigrants, really in weapons against new migrants. They were mostly Central African refugees at the time. And they don't want them. They don't want them to be, they don't want them as the new foreigners.
And the Syrians very often mirror that. They have this similar divide between,
right,
hard to define conservative or not, pro-government, not pro-government.
Yeah. So that's one comment. My question is actually not really related. It's, you talked about this desire to, or sort of a desire that there are young Syrians who want to become the new Jews, and they say it with a sort of irony and say we are the new Jews.
No desire.
Did I understand it correctly?
Well, no, it's not a desire that they want to be. He just said like we are the new Jews.
Okay, so
like we are treated like a group of other, that needs to be assimilated, integrated. And you Germans, you want to teach us now how to be good Germans.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But they want to be good Muslims, actually. They want to be good Syrians.
Okay.
Which is their right, And attached to that, you're German, I guess.
Yes.
Right? Attached to that is the whole discussion in Germany about is Germany a country of immigration or not? And that's really new, right? The politicians say that Islam is part of Germany, that they say Germany ist ein Einwanderungsland. That's just a few years. Before that, a few years ago, politicians would say, no, we are not. Islam doesn't belong here, and we don't want to be in a country where people migrate to. And we have Judeo-Christian roots, but that's enough. We'll stop there.
I was just thinking about this desire that has been expressed by intellectuals often to be the last German Jews. Famously, Edward Said said that at a very late point in his career. I'm the last Adorno. So there's something about this. I was thinking if there's a connection. I don't draw anyone right now, but I was curious what you think about this
it's something
desire to be in that position that many actually associate with. At that position, it doesn't exist anymore. It definitely often neglects the actual German Jews that are in Germany and live as German mentioned. But so I was curious what you think about that connection.
I have to think about it,
yeah.
But it's an obvious connection. Jasper.
I have an article here from the Süddeutsche Zeitung from September 17th, and the headline says that men value integration more negative than do the women in Germany. And I wonder what your perception is of that. Is it true that the men are more against the idea of the immigrants and have a worse relationship with them than do the women in Germany? And why would anyone make a distinction like that?
That is dangerous territory. I remember once my thesis advisor told me to look at how women and men write differently journals, diaries. And then another colleague said like, no, that doesn't make sense. she's not here. So, I can only, my impression is yes, men are more critical, but maybe that's just because German men like to talk more about politics. So I cannot base that on any empirical, scientific data.
All right, you have
okay, I have to be honest. There are more romantic, relations between immigrants and Germans that are German woman and a Muslim man.
But that makes sense with the gender ratio. But most of the refugees are men.
Yeah, of course. So I don't know if perception is different. I hear very often from men and from women, that Middle class, it's more a class thing, I think. Like middle class is worried that, the German economy is threatened, which of course it is not. It is far from being threatened. Germany is still doing very well. It has more to do with the values that people perceive as being threatened, and maybe rightly so, because if Germany is becoming a country of immigration, then it cannot stay where it was. In Bavaria, they just reintroduced the cross in every public building. They took it away from the classroom a few years ago. In every German classroom, there used to be a cross. They did away with that, but now in every Bavarian public building, like courthouses, entry halls of school buildings, there is a cross. There has to be a cross. So it's a fight.
Yeah. Is it dangerous to talk about Germany in general? Aren't there major regional differences with regard to the immigration and politically other issues that arise? I mean, here in America, you could call, in the state of Minnesota, you could call Trump an asshole, and you might not get away with that in Alabama. Are there regional clashes with regard to developing programs that will enable the immigration to go smoothly? Because it is an inconsiderate
It is, yeah. I think this institution that I work for there, the Duale Hochschule Baden-Württemberg, it's like a crossover between a small vocational school, small university, and a community college. It's kind of all these three things together. That's in Baden-Württemberg. And Baden-Württemberg being a very rich country, very progressive in terms of programs to boost the economy. There's a reason that they are trying very hard there to have a very sober vision of, we need these people, so we have to train them, otherwise they're going to work. In general, in the countryside, it's much more difficult, obviously. I think Bavaria, which is more conservative, so it's the same, the usual idiosyncratic characters of different regions in Germany or in the countries, north, south.
The East German countryside, the East German province.
Yeah, even I don't want to live there. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but it's a very difficult situation. German teachers, they don't want to live there. And they sent a lot of refugees there because there's space, right? Because there's place to put up these containers, these living containers. And as you know, East Germans, they were not, now it's already almost 30 years, but they were not used to foreigners. But I don't know if that's the reason, or if it's the mentality of the parents' generation, 2 generations ago. But that's the most problematic still, and probably so for a long time.
One additional question: what about the social media in Germany in general? To what extent does that influence the way different groups are thinking, tendency, and also have the Syrians develop their own sort of newspapers, or I know the Turks have, or stations, and so on and so forth. Has that started?
Not quite yet. I'm sure it will soon, but they are still in the phase. For example, there's an app for you that you can put on your smartphone that guides you all the way from Damascus to Berlin. And connected to this app is like the best ways. What do you call these guys in Germany who try to help you to get a boat?
Schlepper.
Schlepper. Right? What do you call them in English?
No,
you can find them.
traffic.
So in this app, you can see where you find the best ones, what's the best way, and avoid this border control and that. And they're using Facebook a lot to share information. And they watch a lot other Arab like Al Jazeera, they watch other Arab news channels. And I was trying to teach them German values. I was telling them, you have to watch the Tagesschau. It's 8 o'clock every day. I even watched it with them. But I think they didn't find it very sexy, so they didn't want to watch it. But it's totally foreign to them. It probably will change very soon, right? I mean,
It'd be
they
more
were like,
sexy, you mean?
sorry?
It'd be more sexy, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I tried Tagesthemen, it's a bit more.
So I think
I had one couple there, then I stopped. I had one couple there, they had kids, 2 babies, and I brought them to the classroom. And one day I told the parents, super nice guy, the mother from Syria, the young father, and that's interesting also maybe on the final note, the Palestinian, it happens pretty often that Palestinian men go to Syria and they marry there. And we really joked a lot. So I always forgot his name in the beginning, so I just called him Hamas. And then by the end of the class, they all called him Hamas. That's actually they have a lot of Jewish humor there too. And I was telling him in the end, or what you can call Jewish humor if you want to, in the end, I told him, look, are you aware that your kids in 20 years, they might come home with a German girlfriend or a German boyfriend? And they went like, no, they won't.
So I think we have time for one more question, not time you've had your hand up.
Well, I actually don't know if it's a question or an observation that you can comment on, but listening to your narrative, it struck me how much of this is performative. From the public sorting of your recycling to what happens when you put on a kippah, to enacting the language, to a visit to a Holocaust memorial that becomes some ritualized enactment that carries public performance space, to who gets to play the role of victim and who's going to be the Jew and who's the last Adorno. These are all roles where the content doesn't matter as much as the role, and it's on stage and you ask people to change their identities while they're already on stage.
Mm-hmm.
How does that get addressed, if at all?
Well, I would say it's all about roles, right? I would say there's nothing else but roles that we take on, we put aside at different times. But you're totally right, it's very performative. An additional problem is that, I mean, if you try to teach a group values for 2 years, you kind of get to know each other, and there's some trust. So it's difficult. And it is difficult also because when you're geduldet, when you're tolerated only, you kind of develop a technique that you're very selective what you say and to whom. So they're constantly thinking, okay, what can I tell this guy? Okay, he's kind of a professor, a teacher. He probably works for the German government and for the Mossad as well. So I probably don't tell him that. For example, once they told me, I asked them about their birthday. They had a unit their birthdays, and then like 10 of them told me their birthdays on the same day. And I asked them like, "What? Are you making fun of me? That's impossible." And then I could see how it's something that they didn't really want to say officially to me. Something they could never say at the BAMF, at the immigration office. Apparently it works like that in Syria, that you give your date on a certain day, I think in January, in order to avoid the draft. Because then you're born before a certain date or after a certain date. So they told me, yeah, half of Syrian men, they're born on that day. And I asked them, so nobody is kind of questioning that?
That's what I also just want to comment on the subject of the performative. Your slight wince every time you had to say German values and the hesitation.
Sorry.
I mean, no, but I think this point is that it goes both ways, right? That you're also then, of course, involved in enacting your own performance. Well, I would like to just thank everybody. We have a little bit of time if you want to just speak privately with Bernard, continue the conversation. There's a lot of food, so please try to finish it so we don't have to schlep it away. And again, please join me in thanking Bernard for wonderful.